The first tidal recording gauge. In 1832, the world's first tidal recording gauge was installed at Sheerness Royal Dockyard. Tide gauges are instruments used to measure the height and time of high and low tides. To coastal dwelling people, those earning their living from the sea, and seafaring nations, the knowledge, observation and recording of the rise and fall of the tides has always been important. In the 8th century, the earliest reference of the tides in Great Britain can be found in writings by the monk, the Venerable Bede. He observes the union of the ocean with the orbit of the moon, and that high tide takes place at different times around the coast of Britain. In the 13th century, the Abbey of St Albans produced the first known written tide table. It recorded high water at London Bridge. In 1832, civil engineer James Mitchell constructed the first self-registering tide gauge which recorded data at Sheerness. The earliest British tide gauge data comes from this machine. Early in the 19th century, the British Empire was expanding and accurate tide tables became essential. Knowing the timing and heights of tides was crucial to safety at sea and navigation, especially in coastal waters. Even some of our greatest seafarers became victims of the tide. In March 1784, Nelson was captain of the 28-gun HMS Boreas. On its way out of the Medway, the pilot ran her aground off Sheerness. The Boreas was so high and dry that at low tide, people from Sheerness came out and walked around her. James Mitchell's remarkable drawings of his self-registering tide gauge shows its housing, trunk, gauge and clock. Information on the drawing describes how the sea level is recorded on a revolving cylinder driven by a clockwork-operated cogwheel. The self-registering tide gauge automatically records on paper the height and time of the tides. Observers were no longer required to monitor the movement of the tides. Recording became more accurate, and states of the tide could also be recorded at night and during bad weather. Originally erected near the southwest corner of the boat basin in 1832, the tide gauge was moved to Cornwallis Jetty in 1856. The Sheerness self-registering tide gauge was the first erected at any Admiralty dockyard and the first in the world.